Every journey begins with a single step. For many, the first step is the greatest challenge. Yet for all, the obstacles, the doubt, and conviction teach us about ourselves. It's these moments in life, a test of our abilities, our mind, when we don't know, but we still proceed, driven by the unspoken, but ignited by the obsession that yields some of life's greatest lessons and rewards. Join me as we explore incredible stories of leaders forging industries, enterprises, and ultimately, themselves. I'm your host, Adam Giery, and welcome to Capital Class. Let's begin. Classmates, welcome to today's show. As a new-ish parent, few topics utilize more of my mind share as much as caring for the children. On an ever-exhausting list, including who packed the snacks, did someone poop, and do we have their favorite stuffed animal, or in our case, the cat, sits the question of education. What do you expect from a child's earliest years of learning? Is your child enrolled in early childcare education? If this term seems foreign, you likely know this experience as daycare. Yet daycare was a safe place for children to spend time. However valuable, daycare is evolving into a space to accelerate education during the brain's most formative period, critical to long-term learning and social development. This section of education is at an inflection point. Learning, workforce, and learning expectations. On today's episode of Capital Class, we are joined by Dr. Bridget Hamre, co-founder and CEO of Teachstone, an education enterprise focused on children and educator interactions to thrive. Bridget, welcome to Capital Class.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here.
Bridget, 12 years ago, I began in this space, and I would say at that time, the topic received zero attention. The earliest days of explaining to business leaders why this matters, and furthermore, why this is important not only to the learner, but to their employees and to their business, received a bit of a bobblehead response, but a recognition that it's important, but that there wasn't much to be done. How different is the industry and market today from that time?
Yeah. I mean, as you said, it's really transformed. I think there's two pieces of evidence that have been most compelling to folks, and that's the brain science and the economic science, right? So I think we have seen just so much evidence of how quickly children's brains develop during those early years and set the stage for longer term learning. And then the economic evidence is just really clear as well. The sort of investment in those early years is the best investment we can make. And so, whether you're a developmental scientist or a business person, I think we can all understand the value of those early years.
So what is the economic case? And I'll caveat with, I do find sometimes when you're explaining this to someone, it almost feels too far away. Right. So you're investing in a 2, 3, and 4-year-old's learning for their outcomes in, again, to a business leader.
Yeah.
15, 18 years from now. And can that really be tracked?
Yeah. I mean, certainly it can, right? So this research has come from a multitude of places, and the best cited work is by an economist named James Heckman, who has provided a multitude of studies that really show sort of 7-to-1 investment. So every dollar we put in those early years returns $7 down the road. And really early childhood experiences are linked to a range of outcomes. So not just sort of academic performance, but economic mobility, and making sure that kids actually graduate from school, and their sort of social development, the things that I think actually increasingly business leaders understand. I will say, and I think we were reminded of this during the pandemic, there is a sort of shorter term economic argument too, which is about making sure that parents can actually do their jobs, right? And I think when those two things come together, we recognize that it might be okay for us just to think about daycare for that latter purpose, right? Making sure educators or parents can work. But the reality is, as long as we have children in these settings, then we might as well invest in making sure we're getting the most out of them.
You know, you use the daycare word, and
I rarely use that word. So
I as well, but I brought it up this morning because I think it's the first chapter of this story, right? Children going somewhere, not at home,
yep,
in a collective that feels like school, but it's not,
yep,
not regulated, certainly not for years. Now
yep.
much so. Do you see that transition happening? Are people bought in? You know, I think I'd ask the other side of it. Like, there is this world of, is a clean, safe daycare better than maybe some of the situations that a child experiences at home?
I think it's hard to answer that latter question blanketly, right? I think it depends so much on the individual situation and what families need. Children can thrive in all kinds of settings. So I think that I would say it's in an evolution for sure. So we know there's still incredible disparities in the way early childhood is perceived, the way early childhood educators are frankly paid and compensated for their work. Compared to K-12. So we're not on equal footing yet. But I think we've made a lot of progress. And I think we see it most at the sort of pre-K level, right? So we see states really investing in pre-K for 4-year-olds, sometimes for 3-year-olds as well. In some places, those teachers are being compensated at levels the same as their sort of K-12 partners. But we're slower to gain traction on the infants and toddler front, with many people really still seeing that as just place any warm body in the room, and they can change some diapers, and that's really all it's about.
For the listeners, I mean, what is the national average when you talk about pay?
Yes, it varies a lot, but I mean, many of our teachers in programs, whether they're serving, taking care of 4-year-olds or 2-year-olds, are making less than they would make at a fast food restaurant, and oftentimes are making less than their peers who are just down the hallway in the same school building. So typically less than 30,000, with teachers often making much less a year.
And at that same time, like the neuroplasticity of a child's brain, the science, and I would just say this from my own, having been in this space for over a decade, you don't believe it, wrong word. You don't see it until you experience it, right? It's hard to understand it until you're with a child and you're reading it to them every day,
Yeah.
right? You're giving them new words every day. And the next day they understand that word.
Yeah.
Or that language. And I would just put this to anybody: challenge yourself to learn 5 new words in a different language within a week's time. Watch a child do it in a day's time.
Oh, it's so amazing.
And sort of that brain development, right? You have people that are it's like an untapped resource. It's a stock that no one knows about yet, right? It's at that level, in my view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, as parents, we recognize that every moment matters, right? So it's not just those sort of formal instructional moments, because I think that's what people think, like, learning has to happen when children are sitting at desks, right? But the reality is, from birth, really before birth, the conversations that we have, the ways that we interact with kids makes a huge difference in their brain development. When I talk about some of the brain research, some of the most compelling and sad comes from children who've really been deprived, from some cases in places where children were in orphanages. And you just see a complete lack of brain development. These kids were diapered, cared for, fed. They had all of those things that we might think that babies need, but they didn't have anyone talking to them. They didn't have anyone holding them. And it's those things that really set the stage for our development and learning. Now, the good news is, luckily, kids are also, pretty resilient. So even if they haven't had some of those experiences early on, we can make up for them. But I think our work is really about making sure more and more children get access to those experiences. It can be at home, but for those children who are in out-of-home settings, we want to make sure that they have what they need to thrive.
And so let's maybe bury down there for a second.
Yep.
Your organization has kind of two unique sides to the market, right? You have a class, which I'd like you to explain,
Yep.
and QRIS, and quality ratings improvement system. And I think what's unique about this is that for the marketplace, and I'm going to call it a marketplace because largely it is a private market, right? It's, at least in Florida, sub 20% of the providers are public, right?
I mean, a lot of the funding still comes from federal government, but yes, it is largely a private market.
And so in your world, how are you bringing those two products together, your two missions together? I mean, what's the vision, if you could share that?
Yeah. Well, so I think it first probably is worth, I use this word interactions all the time. And it's probably worth actually explaining what that means. Maybe it's obvious, but we used to talk about our work as focused on teaching. So the class that you mentioned, which is something called the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, is an observational tool that we developed at the University of Virginia, which really measures the interactions, what's happening in classrooms that drives development and learning. We used to talk about our work as teaching because everybody understands teaching, right? And so if we talked about us being a company that measures and improves teaching, it made sense to people. But, I think a few years ago, as I came back into the company full time, we recognized that our sort of secret sauce is around interactions, because if you look at the definition of teaching is about conveying information. And we see far too much of that in educational context, whether it's with young children or, I have a high schooler. There's a lot of teaching going on. But developmental science, educational science tells us that is not what actually helps people learn. It is the interactions. It is the back and forth. It is not asking the right question. It is listening to the student's response and then having a back and forth exchange. So it is really those back and forth exchanges in classrooms that we're most interested in assessing. So at a basic level, the work our organization does is we've developed a methodology for observing those interactions at very large scale. We've trained over 200,000 people over the course of the last 20 years on class. We currently have 30,000 certified class observers, and those people are trained pretty rigorously and go out and conduct observations across this country to provide us information with what's going well in those classrooms and areas for improvement. So that really then links to the second part of the business, which is, from the beginning, our work on class hasn't been just about a measure, right? It's been adopted as a part of accountability systems, but from the very beginning, it was incredibly important to us that we made sure that the educators who are doing this work have the supports they need to thrive. So, as we know, sometimes people say what gets measured gets done, but that's not always true. So we invest not only in this sort of measurement work, but making sure there's professional development and coaching that can help educators improve.
When you talk about the educator, right, and I'm in this, locally, I'm on the coalition board. We oversee the entirety of the system.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I'll use fear. It's broad. Like, well, do we really need kids learning, right? Do we need kids sitting down, writing and learning at 2? And from your vantage point, how important is, when you think educator and interactions, is in fact just having someone there to help them learn how to just deal with people, how to deal with difficult situations? That's what I've observed most in the high quality classrooms I visited. It's not the writing that looks great. It's not the math. I mean, that feels good because you understand it.
Yeah.
It's how adjusted the children are.
Yeah. Yeah. We often talk about the focus on some core skills, relationships, self-regulation, communication, and thinking, right? So yes, academic learning, math, reading, that matters. But you can't develop those skills if you don't develop those core foundational skills. So we really look at the interactions that support children developing positive relationships with their teachers and with their peers, which, we all know is incredibly important. Self-regulation, which sometimes can sound like kind of a wonky word, but in reality, it's just us learning to manage our own behavior and attention. We realize as a, CEO of a company of 200 people, I recognize the need for both of those skills never goes away, right? And then communication and thinking, making sure children know how to communicate their ideas, to ask questions, and then thinking, right? It is not just about learning the ABCs, but about truly developing the kind of comprehension skills that we know are going to help kids thrive later in life.
And from your view, reflecting back on your research, but also with your organization, what's a common misconception?
That's a great question. Well, certainly you sort of took the daycare piece of it. I really do think people think anyone can do it, right?
Yeah.
That you don't need any training to take care of babies, or what you need is just training in health and safety. I would say actually we experience this all the time with educators, particularly those who were trained maybe 15, 20 years ago, who are still working in the field, that the job of an early childhood educator, they think, is just to set up the conditions and then let kids play, right? And that actually teaching or interactions could interfere with learning. So we've had to do a lot of retraining of educators to teach them about how essential their interactions are. That doesn't mean that they need to be, again, having all the kids sitting around in desks. We want kids to be playing, but what I want to see when kids are playing is that the educator's moving around that room, sitting down with them, and taking opportunities to really scaffold their learning, because that's when the true power of the educator comes through.
You talk about the power of the educator. There's a lot of talk about the technology going as early as 2, 3.
Yeah.
And I wonder, from your vantage point, is it accelerant on the learning? Is it potentially a hindrance on learning? And I think I'll give you an out here, which is like within moderation, right? So that it's not naturally anything within moderation to some extent. But from your view, are you seeing it work? Like, I know there are very successful companies out there with incredible gains.
Yep.
But I also know there are parents, and I'll share that I was one of them. I had a classroom that was too much smartboard, too much YouTube. And so we moved out of that school. Great school. It's just for what we needed. It just wasn't the right fit.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we have to be real, right? There are certainly plenty in the early childhood field who think there is no technology that should be in any classrooms. I think that's crazy, right? Like, think about the world our kids are growing up in. We want them from early on to know how to interact with these materials in ways that are going to support them. Now, on the other extreme, to your point, the idea that a 2-year-old can just sit behind a computer and learn by themselves everything they need to learn is equally ridiculous. And so, I think yes to moderation, but I think it's really about intentionality on the part of the educator. How are they using those tools? And frankly, from the folks designing them. One of the things that I've started to say, I've vetted this with people who know more than I do about AI, is that, AI is going to get much better, even for young children, maybe as young as 3 and 4, at teaching. I mean, imagine you're a preschool teacher. You have 17, 18 children at hugely varying levels of their early reading skills, right? Some who already know all their letters, maybe can even write a few words, and some who've almost never been introduced to books, right? I think technology is going to get better at helping us individualize instruction in some of those core skills in really interesting and engaging ways for kids that we shouldn't be afraid of. On the flip side, I will say, if we think back to some of those core skills I was talking about, relationships, communication, thinking. I think those are harder to get through technology. So in my view, actually, the work that we're doing focused on interactions is just going to become a more and more important part of preparing educators really across the age span.
We talk a lot about the journey, right? From idea to enterprise. And what's unique about your story is that you decided to build a business years before I think the industry was where I think everyone would say it's a recognized part of the sector, right? In the K-20, it used to be K-12, right? And then higher ed was kind of the first one. Like, oh, well, it's not just K-12, it's lifelong learning. They're like, oh, well, wait. Then you're really the last piece, right? Like, and early learning. Like, oh, okay.
Someday we'll get to all the old people, right?
Yeah. And so, but the origins of the story often lead to the success of an enterprise. And so I ask, can you take us back to the beginning? What did those earliest days look like as not only you build a product, build a business, but you really build a market?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to say, I think we have a pretty unique trajectory. And my co-founder, Bob Pianta, who just stepped down last year as Dean of the School of Education here at the University of Virginia, sometimes he might say he had this idea all along, but in reality, it really did start with research. So I actually did my doctoral training with Bob Pianta at the University of Virginia. And at the time, we were conducting some longitudinal studies of children and asking the question, what really matters in their out-of-home experience? And that was the sort of infancy of class, how it was developed. It was really a research tool to help us identify what matters in children's experiences in out-of-home settings. And after the research started to pile up, I think policymakers and others started to pay attention. And the real catalyst for the company came at a moment probably 10 years after we started the initial work on class, when class was actually adopted as a part of the federal Head Start system. And it was put in as a part of their sort of monitoring and quality improvement system. And, at the time, I think at that time, we'd probably trained about 50 people on how to use class, all researchers. And suddenly we were asked to train 5,000 in 3 months. So it really catapulted. And we learned quickly that the university is a great place to start ideas, but it's not a great place to scale a business.
Yes.
So that was really the genesis of the initial spin out of Teachstone.
And how big in its earliest days was Teachstone?
In its earliest days, it was a few people, right? Like I think when we first moved out of the university officially, it was about 10 people maybe. And frankly, at the time, we were still doing a lot of the core research over at the university. And I stayed at the university full time. I always say I kept my day job for a really long time until 2018. So we really scaled the business while, Bob and I were still focused on some of the core research.
So you received the federal, we'll call it mandate, encouragement, and now you have to train 5,000 teachers. I mean, it almost feels impossible.
Yeah, well, I learned early. I think the reason Bob and I get along well is like nothing's impossible, right? It's just a new challenge to be faced. I think we had a solid foundation on which to build, but yeah, it was insane for sure. Those early days were like any other startup, right? We were living sort of grant to grant. We were, trying to figure out how to recruit people to come live in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? Which is a lovely town, but not one where we have a, diverse group of folks to hire from. And just trying to, here's what I will say, we were lucky from the beginning of our organization until I would say sort of just at this moment, we've really grown pretty organically and just responding to the demand that's come to us. So, we've grown quickly. But yeah, there's been a lot of learning along the way for sure.
From its infancy, right, a research-based tool, did you find that as you grew the business that the interaction, like the research says one thing, but then the politics and the perceptions, right? Sometimes not even it's just we feel a way about something. Because my first interaction with class was when I think it was, I'm obviously in Florida.
Yep.
We had a rollout, and then we kind of, things had to be adjusted. And, I can imagine for a business, you're sitting here saying, well, the research is clear. Like, this isn't, I'll call it a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And then you're running up against substantial headwinds.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the learning has been, again, it's one thing to have a great idea. It's another thing to scale a business, right? So, there is so much good research sitting in universities having no impact because people aren't paying attention to how to actually scale that research and have a meaningful impact. And it's an entirely different science, right? So when we use class as a research tool, we're just going out to classrooms, we're observing, we're testing children, we're seeing if there's a correlation between those things. To your point, in Florida, it's about designing a system that allows, thousands and thousands of observations, tens of thousands of observations to be conducted with some measure of fidelity. And most importantly, I'll come back to that idea of improvement, right? We've learned a lot about making sure that as systems implement class, that it's not just used as an accountability tool, but really invested on the improvement side. So our learning has been about how we partner with state agencies and local entities. And we've learned a ton from them, right? I think some of our best innovations have really come from listening to our partners, watching them innovate with the tool, and then taking those innovations to other spaces.
People see you now, right? Business successful, 2 established, recognized products. Sounds like 200 people. What they don't see was the quiet moments, the doubt, right? The concerns, the questions of if you can do it, which by the way, entrepreneur faces, this host included. When did it click? When did you feel like the momentum began to carry you versus you and your co-founder carrying the business?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think often it comes down to leadership, right? And so if I think of the first phase of the company as being startup, like there was not a lot of clicking there, right? Or not that kind of clicking, not a sense of security. But we got to a place, I think Bob and I recognized that we really needed to bring in an established business leader. And we actually made a change early on. We actually started Teachstone as a nonprofit. Very intentionally, we actually did some research and made an intentional decision to start as a nonprofit. And a couple of years in, we just recognized that to be able to recruit the talent that we needed to grow as a business and to create a sort of reliable structure for the company, a change in our tax status made a whole lot of sense. And we brought on an experienced K-12 education company leader who was transformational, right? Because what do we know about building a sales team, right? Building a marketing team, go-to-market plans. Like there's just implementation, customer support, all of the things that, as an academic, no one, you don't think about. So that was really a transformational moment. It took that leader a little while to establish, I think, some of the normative business cycles that we needed to feel more secure.
I'm sure it took a healthy dose of hubris. I think everybody wants to think that they can make it in business, and that's normal, right? They want to be successful. And yet it takes a lot of leader to look and say, I'm great at some things, and those things are undeniable, but there's another side of this business that needs to be run, and there's possibly someone better.
Yeah. Well, I kind of liked my day job at UVA, so I don't know that was harder. I would actually say what was harder is my decision in 2018 to leave academia and go and join the company. I knew, and Bob and I had this conversation, a lot of my academic friends would look down on that, right? Like, oh, you're just, going out to make money off of an idea. So that was not easy. But I think at the time I really saw the need for the organization to sort of have a little bit more founder in its day to day as we continue to grow. And so if it was sort of startup, become a business was the second phase. The third phase, since I came back to the company full time, I think has really been about grounding in our impact and demonstrating a thesis that our impact and our financial success can really travel side by side. So yeah, that part, I never intended to be a CEO. Let's just say that.
When you think about progress, right, beyond revenue, beyond business terms, how do you measure it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great because we have a measure, right? And that measure is making sure more and more children have access to the interactions that we need to thrive. And, I think a part of the magic of what we do, some people disagree with it even being possible, but we can go into a classroom for 2 hours and provide a set of numbers, a set of scores that assess the quality of that environment. And we know from a lot of research, so class in its simplest form, we measure sort of 10 different types of interactions, but those all get consolidated up to a score. Class is scored on a 1 to 7 scale, 1 being low, 7 being high. In general, research shows that when programs are about at a 5, which isn't like fantastic, right? Some researchers have called it good enough teaching. It's at that level that we really start to see positive outcomes for kids. So our goal is going out and working with our system partners to make sure that we resource more and more programs to actually create the conditions that allow those kinds of interactions to happen.
Powerful. When you dream, how big is Teachstone? And big could be in any way, right? It could be size, it could be impact, it could be countries, it could be the reach. I mean, what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, we've just been doing some vision work and our vision. So we estimate roughly that we impact about 2 million children a year right now. And we think we can get to 20 in 5 years. And to your point, that could happen in a variety of ways. So we haven't talked about this, but class actually exists across the age levels. So we actually have stronger research evidence about interactions mattering in middle and high school than we do in the early childhood years. Wow. We just haven't focused on that part of our business. And it's obviously a very different sort of go-to-market plan. So there's huge opportunity in the K-12 space. And in fact, just last week, I was in Hong Kong. There's over 30 published papers on class in China and Hong Kong. There's actually 50 different countries that have used class for research. And at the furthest extreme, this is my favorite, there's a professor in Germany who for the past 10 years has been using class and our sort of video-based coaching methodology with the coaches and trainers who work with Olympic gymnasts. So I think this idea of interactions has a pretty broad applicability. And our question, and something I get better at over time, is just focus, right? We can't do it all. So where do we decide in this next 5 years to really focus our energies and hopefully create a bigger impact in the world?
A lot of entrepreneurs begin to embody their businesses, right? It's as if their identity is one and the same, and can make it hard to turn off, unplug. How do you recharge?
Well, I have 3 kids. I have a 17-year-old son, and then I have 10-year-old twin girls. And, spending time with them is the best way to unplug. They're also the best ones to remind me that I need to pay attention, right? So at Christmas, they got me a set of cards that were about like stress management and mindfulness. I thought it was maybe a little bit of a cue from them that maybe I'd been a little stressed of late. And then, I'm lucky enough to live here in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. And so being out in nature is another thing that's important to me. So my kids in nature are probably my 2 biggest refuelings.
In my experience, it's that quiet time in however you can get it, either be it meditative or reading or exercise, but I can totally understand.
Yeah, I wake up every morning and early enough so that I can read the New York Times and have a cup of coffee, right? That is a part of my morning meditative practice for sure.
I'll reciprocate that. I find that if I don't, and it's strange, I haven't written it down, But if I don't do these routines in the morning, I actually feel off.
Yeah.
They're so foundational to the day.
Yeah.
Bridget, what an incredible story, incredible journey. We get all of our guests out. We call our fast four. So these are just quick, come to your mind, right? Let it ride.
All right. Ready? I'm ready.
As an entrepreneur, what are the trends emerging that interest you?
I think this idea of what skills really matter for children, regardless of age level. I think, yes, we see this big push around the science of reading, but the reality is, social and emotional skills, which I'll put in quotes because people have lots of feelings about that terminology, but children's abilities to relate to each other, to regulate, those things are so critically important. And frankly, the educational system sees them as not their problem. And I think that's going to change. And if it doesn't change, I think we're going to start to see real impediments to our ability to support children. If you look at the number of kids who aren't attending school, levels of depression, all of these things are really warning signs to us, for sure.
One place in the world everyone needs to visit.
Ooh. Gosh. Well, I grew up in Northern California, so I'll say the Northern California coast, Highway 1. I don't know that it gets any better than that.
I agree. Greatest area of growth for you in the coming year?
Greatest area of growth. Patience. I think I always have a million things I want to do, and I recognize sort of focus and patience are things I have to continually cultivate if I want to have an impact.
The entrepreneur's plight.
Yeah.
Favorite podcast that everyone needs to be listening to?
I'm going to maybe get it wrong, but I have a great friend and colleague, Dave Adams. I think it's called Innovation in Education. I'm going to get it wrong, but if you Google Dave Adams, he's the CEO of Urban Assembly, an incredible organization in New York City, but he is just a dynamic personality, and every single conversation that he has is fascinating. So I'd highly recommend it.
Bridget, thank you for an incredible story and for your work with children. This is truly impactful. Thank you for joining the show.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining today's episode of Capital Class. If you're interested in joining our next discussion, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast platforms. Capital Class is a venture with the Strategist Podcast Network. To view the entire lineup of shows, visit strategistgroup.com. I'm Adam Giery. Class is closed.